The grand ballroom was alive with laughter and chatter as the guests gathered for the evening's celebration. The chandelier above sparkled, casting warm light across the polished marble floor, and the smell of expensive perfume mixed with the scent of freshly cut flowers. At the center of it all stood Victor Caldwell, a well-dressed billionaire, chatting with a few business partners. His smile was flawless, his posture perfect, the picture of success, but everything was about to change. Suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the noise, piercing the air like a siren. "Dad, they're trying to kill you." The words rang out, loud and clear, freezing everyone in place. The laughter ceased. Conversations halted. Victor turned, his face momentarily frozen in confusion as his eyes scanned the crowd. At the back of the room, near the entrance, stood a little girl. Her eyes were wide with panic, her small hands clenched into fists. She was no more than 6 or 7, with braided hair and worn clothes, her voice trembling but unmistakably strong. "Dad, they're trying to kill you," she shouted again, her voice rising above the murmur of shocked whispers. Victor's heart skipped a beat. His gaze snapped to her, and his mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who was this child, and why was she shouting at him? The guests turned, some with curiosity, others with skepticism. Was this a prank? A joke? But the little girl stood firm, not flinching under the weight of all those eyes on her. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. A few moments later, a woman in the crowd, clearly embarrassed, stepped forward, trying to smooth over the situation. "It's just a child's imagination," she said, her voice dismissive. "She doesn't know what she's talking about." But the little girl wasn't backing down. Her eyes never left Victor's. "Please," she said, her voice now quieter but no less urgent. "Don't touch the drink." She pointed toward the table where Victor had left his glass of wine. "It's poisoned. I saw her put something in it." Victor's heart raced as his mind tried to catch up with what she was saying. He stepped toward the table slowly, his hand hovering over the glass, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Was this child telling the truth? Had someone truly tried to poison him? His instincts told him to be cautious, but the shock of the situation made it hard to think clearly. The room was silent, everyone watching him, waiting for him to act. The little girl stepped closer, her small voice barely audible now. "I swear," she said, "I saw her do it. Please, don't drink it." Victor looked around, but the guests seemed unsure, still questioning the child's credibility. Some were already dismissing her as just a frightened little girl. But something about the way she spoke, something in the sincerity of her words made him hesitate. His fingers brushed the rim of the glass, and he suddenly felt the weight of all eyes on him. Should he risk it? Should he take a drink from a glass that might have been tampered with? The room seemed to close in around him, the tension palpable, as he stood there, caught between disbelief and the chilling possibility that this child might be right. Victor stood there, frozen in place, his hand hovering just above the glass of wine, the weight of the moment sinking in. The room had gone eerily quiet. All eyes were on him. The little girl, standing across the room with her fists clenched, didn't flinch. Her gaze was unwavering, locked onto him with a sincerity that left him breathless. He could feel the tension building, the air thick with anticipation. Every breath felt too loud. "Don't touch it," she had said, her voice trembling with urgency. "It's poisoned." It sounded absurd. How could a child know something like that? And yet, there was something in her voice, something that stirred a deep, uncomfortable feeling inside him. Something was off. The guests murmured amongst themselves, their faces twisted in disbelief, some sneering, others uncertain. "It's just a child's fantasy," someone muttered from the crowd, trying to dismiss the little girl's warning with a laugh. But Victor couldn't move. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Why would she say that? He thought. Who is she? His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. The woman who had spoken earlier, one of the guests, stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding. She was trying to play it off, trying to smooth things over, but Victor couldn't stop staring at the girl. There was something in her eyes, a fire that no child could fake. She wasn't scared. She wasn't crying. She was standing her ground. "Please," the little girl said again, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "I saw her do it. She put something in your drink." Victor's heart pounded in his chest, a cold shiver running down his spine. The glass of wine, the one he had left on the table moments ago, seemed to mock him now. He had only intended to take a sip, just a small one, but now, with the girl's words hanging in the air, he wasn't sure if he could trust it. The woman who had tried to dismiss her took a step forward, her face now flushed with frustration. "This is ridiculous," she said, rolling her eyes. "Why are we entertaining this? She's just a child." But Victor's eyes never left the little girl. His mind swirled with thoughts, with doubts, but one thing was clear. The girl believed what she was saying. And for some reason, Victor couldn't ignore her. She had warned him, and in that warning was something far more powerful than any of the dismissive comments from the adults in the room. His hand, which had been hovering near the glass, dropped to his side. He took a step back. The guests began to murmur again, more loudly this time, but he couldn't bring himself to care. His gaze was locked on the girl. "You really saw her do it?" Victor asked, his voice shaky, barely above a whisper. The little girl nodded, her small face filled with determination. "Yes, I did. She put something in it. I saw it with my own eyes. Please, don't drink it." There was no fear in her voice, no uncertainty, just the cold, unrelenting certainty that Victor could feel down to his bones. His mind screamed at him to walk away, to ignore this. But a part of him, the part that had built his empire on intuition and gut feelings, couldn't shake the truth of her words. "Please," the little girl said again, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "I saw her do it. She put something in your drink." Victor's heart pounded in his chest, a cold shiver running down his spine. The glass of wine, the one he had left on the table moments ago, seemed to mock him now. He had only intended to take a sip, just a small one, but now, with the girl's words hanging in the air, he wasn't sure if he could trust it. He took another step back, his mind made up. "I'm not drinking it," he said quietly, his voice filled with more conviction than he felt. The room fell into silence again, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The little girl gave a small, relieved nod, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since she had entered the room. But as the seconds passed, Victor's mind raced. Who would do something like this? Who would want him dead? And why would this little girl, this stranger, be the one to save him? It was a question that gnawed at him, that would haunt him long after the night was over. He could already feel the weight of the truth pushing down on him, waiting to be uncovered. Victor stood motionless, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on him. What if she was right? What if someone had tried to poison him? His fingers trembled slightly as he took another step back from the table. The glass of wine, once inviting, now seemed like a trap, a dangerous temptation. Victor could hear the guests around him, talking in low voices, some now starting to question the little girl's intentions. "Is she lying?" someone whispered. "Or is this some sort of twisted joke?" But it didn't matter. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut. He had just stepped away from the glass, but the room was still buzzing with a mixture of disbelief and quiet speculation. The little girl stood across the room, watching him closely, her small hands still clenched into fists. She hadn't moved, her gaze never leaving him. He could feel her eyes on him, burning with a quiet intensity that seemed to pierce through the noise of the crowd. For a moment, there was only silence. He glanced around the room, trying to steady his thoughts, but all he could focus on was the little girl. The guests had started to talk again, their voices low but filled with doubt. "Who is she?" someone whispered. "What does she know?" Others were beginning to glance at the glass of wine, as if they too could sense that something wasn't right. But Victor couldn't just stand there, paralyzed by fear and confusion. He had to know. He had to find out if the little girl was telling the truth. Taking a deep breath, he finally turned back to the girl. "Show me," he said, his voice firm, but his heart racing. The little girl didn't flinch. Instead, she nodded and slowly approached him, her steps steady despite the tension in the room. She reached into the pocket of her worn coat and pulled out a small, crumpled USB drive. It was so ordinary, so unremarkable, that for a split second, Victor wondered if it was some kind of trick. But then, as she walked closer, he saw the look in her eyes, determined, unwavering. "This is what I saw," she said, holding out the drive. "The camera in the car, she didn't know I was there, but I saw her put something in your drink. It's all on this." The words hit Victor like a punch to the stomach. His mind flashed back to the moment she had first warned him, the strange chill he had felt, and the sudden weight of his decision to walk away from the glass. The tension in the room was palpable, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for anything to happen next. Victor's mind was racing, but there was one thing he was sure of. He couldn't ignore the warning. There was something in her voice, something in the certainty of her words that made his pulse quicken. He had to do something. "I need proof," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. He had trusted her then, but now, with the evidence in his hands, he had no choice but to confront the truth. The guests around him were beginning to murmur, some casting skeptical glances at the girl, others at the USB drive in Victor's hand. He could hear the whispers, feel the judgment in the air, but he didn't care. He had to know. Without another word, Victor walked briskly over to the nearest laptop, his hands trembling as he inserted the USB drive. The woman on the screen was none other than one of the most trusted figures in his inner circle. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had been betrayed. "No," Victor whispered, his voice cracking as he watched the footage. The woman, the one he had trusted, had deliberately poisoned his drink. His throat tightened as he replayed the video, each frame confirming what the little girl had said. It was undeniable. He had been right to trust her. He turned to look at the girl, who was now standing behind him, her expression still calm but watchful. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The little girl's lips twitched into a small smile. "I saw her in the parking lot earlier," she said softly. "I overheard her talking to someone. She was making sure you'd be at the party tonight. She said something about your drink. I didn't know exactly what, but I knew something wasn't right. So, I followed her, and I saw her do it." Victor's mind was reeling, but one thing was certain. The girl had saved his life. Without her, he would have drunk that glass of wine, and who knew what would have happened. The room was now completely silent, the truth hanging heavy in the air. The little girl had exposed the lie, the treachery, and in doing so, had saved him. Victor turned back to the screen, his fingers still trembling as he closed the laptop. He looked at the girl, his heart swelling with gratitude and disbelief. "You've done more for me than anyone else here tonight," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." She nodded, her eyes softening for the first time since she had walked into the room. "I just wanted to help." Victor stood in the silence of the room, the weight of the revelation pressing heavily on his chest. The screen in front of him still displayed the damning footage, the image of the woman he had trusted, someone from his inner circle deliberately poisoning his drink. His hands were still shaking, but the realization was settling in, cold and hard. The truth was undeniable now. The people around him had already begun to murmur, some in disbelief, others in shock. "I can't believe it," someone whispered. "She's been with him for years. How could she do this?" Another voice joined in. "That's insane. How could she betray him like that?" Victor's thoughts were a whirlwind, a storm of disbelief and anger. He had trusted her. He had brought her into his life, into his world, and she had betrayed him. But there was no time for rage. Not now. Not when there was still work to be done. He needed to confront her. He needed to know why. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room, finally landing on the little girl who had saved his life. She was standing a few feet away, still watching him with calm, unblinking eyes. The tension in the air was thick, but she was unfazed. He walked towards her, his mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. "You saved me," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. The girl simply nodded, her eyes softening a little. "I had to," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't deserve to be hurt." Victor looked down at the USB drive in his hand, still amazed by how something so small could contain the key to saving his life. "I need to know how you knew," he said, his voice urgent. "How did you figure this out?" The girl hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I was just following her," she said softly. "I heard her talking to someone in the parking lot. She said she was going to make sure you'd be here tonight. She knew you'd be at the party, and she said something about your drink. That's when I got scared. I didn't know exactly what she was going to do, but I knew something wasn't right. So, I watched her." Victor's mind spun as he processed her words. She had followed the woman. She had overheard the conversation. She had seen the danger before anyone else had even suspected it. It was almost surreal, how this young girl had been the one to expose the truth, to save him from a fate he hadn't even known was coming. "You were brave," Victor said, his voice filled with awe. "You didn't have to do that. You could have just stayed away, but you didn't." The little girl shrugged, her gaze steady. "I didn't want you to get hurt. I just wanted to help." Victor's heart swelled with gratitude, and something else, something that had been missing for so long. He had spent his life building an empire, creating wealth, and gaining influence, but he had never felt this kind of pure, selfless loyalty from anyone. It was humbling. He couldn't remember the last time someone had done something for him without expecting anything in return. And here was this child, standing in front of him, willing to risk everything to make sure he was safe. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saving my life." She nodded, her small face softening. "You don't have to thank me. I just did what was right." Victor stood there for a moment, trying to compose himself. The room around him was still, the air charged with an unspoken understanding. The woman who had poisoned his drink was still out there, somewhere, but Victor's focus was now on the girl in front of him. He needed to deal with this betrayal, but he also knew something else he needed to protect her. She had done something incredible tonight, something that had changed the course of everything. And now, it was his turn to do something for her. "Come with me," Victor said, his voice firm. "I need to talk to you. There's a lot more going on here, and you deserve to know everything." The little girl nodded, stepping closer to him. She didn't ask questions, didn't hesitate. She simply followed his lead. As they made their way toward the door, the whispers from the guests continued, but Victor didn't care. He had something more important to focus on now, something that mattered far more than the opinions of those around him. He had a life to protect, and the girl who had saved it. Victor led the little girl through the crowd, the eyes of the guests still heavy on him. His mind was spinning, thoughts racing faster than he could process them. The room had been full of laughter and celebration just moments ago, but now it felt like an oppressive silence had settled. He could hear the low murmur of voices behind him, but they seemed far away, like a distant echo. His focus was entirely on the girl walking beside him. He hadn't expected any of this child, this warning, this betrayal, but now, with everything happening so fast, he realized there was no going back. He had to get to the bottom of this. They stepped into the quiet hallway, the sounds of the ballroom fading behind them. Victor glanced down at the girl, her small frame barely visible beside him. He still couldn't wrap his mind around it. How could someone he had trusted so deeply, someone who had been with him for years, do something like this? The video on the laptop, the woman in his circle slipping something into his drink, it all felt unreal. But the truth was staring him in the face. He had to face it. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, glancing down at the girl. She nodded, her eyes steady, unshaken by the chaos of the last few minutes. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I just didn't want you to get hurt." Victor nodded, a lump rising in his throat. He had spent his life building wealth, status, and power, but no amount of money or influence had ever made him feel this way. This child, this girl who had stepped up when no one else had done something for him that no one in his world ever had. She had saved his life. He needed to protect her now. They reached a small, private room at the end of the hall. Victor opened the door, and they stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the air cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the tension and noise of the party they had just left. He closed the door behind them and turned to face the girl, his heart still pounding. "I need you to tell me everything you know," he said, his voice steady but urgent. The little girl met his gaze, her expression still calm. "I overheard her talking to someone outside," she began. "I didn't know exactly what they were saying, but I heard her mention your drink. She was making sure you'd be there. She said something about how she was going to get you alone. I was scared when I heard that, so I followed her." Victor felt a chill run down his spine. He had been the target of something much bigger than he had realized. He thought he was just at a party, celebrating like everyone else, but in that moment, it was clear he had been a pawn in a much larger game. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You saved my life. If you hadn't warned me..." I don't even want to think about what could have happened." She shrugged, her gaze softening. "I didn't do it for thanks. I just didn't want you to get hurt. No one should hurt you. I knew you would help." There was something in her words, something simple and pure, that shook Victor to his core. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice quiet. The girl hesitated for a moment before responding. "When I was younger, my mom always said there were good people in the world, even if they didn't always look the way you expected. She said the right people would always help when you needed it most." Victor swallowed hard, his heart tightening. This little girl, who had been through so much, was standing in front of him, talking about hope and goodness like it was a simple truth. "Your mom sounds like a wise woman," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded, looking down at her shoes for a moment. "She was, but she's not here anymore." The words hit Victor like a punch. He didn't know what to say. There was so much he didn't know about this girl, so much that was left unsaid. But one thing was clear. She had been through more than most people could imagine, and yet, she still stood tall, still willing to help a stranger, still willing to do what was right. "You've got a lot of courage," Victor said, his voice soft but filled with admiration. The girl met his gaze again, her eyes steady and unflinching. "I just do what I can." Victor's mind was still racing, but he took a deep breath, grounding himself in the present moment. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. This wasn't just about him. This was about someone trying to take him down, trying to destroy everything he had built. He had to find out why, and he had to do it fast. "I'm going to make sure you're safe," he said, his voice firm. "You don't need to worry about anything anymore. I'll protect you." She gave him a small, grateful smile, but there was something else in her eyes, something deeper, something that told him she had already known what it meant to fight for survival. She wasn't just a child, she was a survivor, and now, they were in this together. Victor paced the small room, his thoughts spinning as he processed the gravity of the situation. The girl, the one who had saved his life, stood quietly by the window, her small form outlined against the dim light. Victor could barely believe what had happened, what was happening. The woman in his inner circle, someone he had trusted without question, had tried to kill him. It was unfathomable. And yet, the evidence was right in front of him. The video, the warning from the girl, all pointed to the same truth. He had narrowly escaped death. He needed to act quickly, but he knew there was more at play here. This wasn't just a simple betrayal. Someone was orchestrating this, and whoever it was, they wouldn't stop until their mission was complete. His mind raced as he formulated a plan. The girl had been the key to uncovering the plot, but there was still so much he didn't know. He needed to find out who was behind this, who was pulling the strings. He couldn't let this go unnoticed. As he turned to face her, the weight of the responsibility hit him. Protecting her had to be his priority now. She had put herself in danger by warning him. She had risked everything to make sure he was safe. He couldn't let her down. "We need to get out of here," Victor said, his voice firm but urgent. "It's not safe anymore." The girl didn't react immediately, but he could see the understanding in her eyes. She had known from the start that this was more than just a simple warning. The stakes were higher than either of them had imagined. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice steady, though he could tell she was just as shaken by the events as he was. "We're going to find out who did this," Victor replied, his jaw set. "And we're going to make sure they can't hurt anyone else." He walked over to the door, unlocking it quietly before stepping out into the hallway. The building was quiet now, eerily still after the chaos of the party. The soft hum of the air conditioning was the only sound, and even that felt too loud. As they walked down the hall, Victor's mind raced through his options. He had the resources, the connections, but time was running out. Whoever was behind this was likely watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. He needed to act quickly before it was too late. The girl walked beside him, her footsteps light but purposeful. She had shown more courage in the last few hours than most people did in a lifetime, and Victor couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for her. She wasn't just a child, she was a survivor. And right now, she was his only ally. "I'm going to get you somewhere safe," Victor said, his tone softening slightly as he glanced at her. "Then, we'll figure out what comes next." The girl nodded, her expression serious, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Victor couldn't blame her. She had already seen too much, been through too much. She had been forced to grow up faster than anyone should. They reached the elevator, and as the doors slid open, Victor stepped inside, his mind still racing. The girl followed, her eyes scanning the empty hallway one last time before the doors closed. The elevator descended in silence, the weight of the situation hanging heavily between them. Victor felt his phone buzz in his pocket, a reminder that the world outside was still turning, even as everything inside felt like it was falling apart. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from his trusted assistant, a warning about a potential security breach. He quickly read through the message, his eyes narrowing. This wasn't just about him. This was bigger, much bigger. The girl noticed the change in his demeanor, her eyes flicking to his phone. "What is it?" she asked, her voice quiet but full of curiosity. "Someone else is involved," Victor replied, his voice tight. "This goes beyond a simple act of betrayal. I need to move fast." The elevator dinged softly as they reached the ground floor. The doors slid open, and Victor stepped out, his mind already racing toward the next move. He had to get to the bottom of this, and he had to do it before anyone else got hurt. As they walked toward the car waiting outside, Victor's thoughts flashed to the woman who had poisoned his drink. He still couldn't believe it. She had been close, someone he had trusted, but now, there was no time to dwell on that. The girl needed protection. His next steps were crucial. "We need to find out who's behind this," Victor said, his voice steady, "and we need to do it before they make another move." The girl looked up at him, her face serious. "I'm ready," she said. "Whatever comes next." Victor nodded, a sense of resolve settling over him. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain: he couldn't do this alone. And now, he didn't have to. Victor's mind raced as he and the girl stepped into the sleek black car waiting for them outside. The city lights blurred past the windows as the car sped through the streets, its tires humming against the asphalt. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts, but Victor couldn't afford to dwell on the quiet for long. He had to focus. He had to find out who was behind the plot to kill him, and he had to do it fast. The girl sat across from him, her eyes fixed on the passing cityscape. He couldn't help but glance at her every so often. She had saved his life, and now she was his only ally in this tangled mess. What kind of life had she lived, he wondered, to have the courage to do what she did tonight? She wasn't just some scared little girl. She was a survivor, and in her own quiet way, she was just as determined to get to the bottom of this as he was. "You okay?" Victor asked, his voice softer than before. The girl nodded but didn't look at him. "I'm fine," she replied, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. Victor could tell she was trying to appear composed, but the truth was, they were both in over their heads. He had spent years building an empire, creating wealth and influence, but now everything felt uncertain. The world he had once controlled seemed to be slipping through his fingers. His thoughts turned back to the woman who had tried to kill him, the woman who had been so close to him for years, someone he had trusted. It was impossible to understand. How had she gone from being a trusted ally to a cold-blooded traitor? Who was she working with? And why was she targeting him? "We're getting close," Victor said, his voice filled with resolve. "I can feel it, but we need to make sure we cover all our bases." He turned to the girl. "You did the right thing by warning me, but now it's my turn to protect you. We'll figure this out together." She looked up at him then, her gaze steady and unwavering. "I'm not scared," she said quietly, but there was a depth in her voice that caught Victor off guard. "I just want to make sure they don't hurt anyone else." Her words hit him hard. She wasn't just worried about herself. She cared about other people. And in that moment, Victor realized how much he had underestimated her. She wasn't just brave, she was compassionate. They were on the same side now, and he was more grateful for her than he could ever express. As the car turned onto a quieter street, the driver pulled over in front of a nondescript building. "We're here," Victor said, his voice steady. He took a deep breath, knowing that this was just the beginning. The real work had yet to start. They stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at their skin as they made their way inside the building. It was an old office building, tucked away in a part of the city that most people never visited, the kind of place that looked empty and forgotten, but in reality, it was exactly what they needed. They walked through the entrance, past rows of locked doors and abandoned offices. The building was eerily quiet, the air stale with the scent of dust and old paper. Victor led the way to the back, where a single office was lit. He knocked once before opening the door. Inside, an older man sat at a desk, his eyes sharp behind thick glasses. He looked up as they entered, his expression unreadable. "Victor," the man said with a nod, his voice deep and gravelly. "I take it, you're here about the situation." Victor didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I need to know everything you can tell me about the woman who tried to kill me," he said, his voice low and urgent. The man leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in front of his face. "You've got a lot of enemies, Victor," he said, his tone matter of fact. "But this one is different." Victor's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" The man leaned forward, his gaze focused. "She's not just working alone. There's someone else behind her, someone who's been pulling the strings for a long time. You've been targeted because of something bigger than you realize. This isn't just about your business, Victor. This is about power, control." Victor clenched his jaw, trying to absorb the weight of the man's words. "Who's behind this?" he demanded. The man didn't answer immediately. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a folder, placing it on the desk. "I've been tracking this for months," he said. "But we don't have much time. If you want answers, you'll have to act fast." He pushed the folder toward Victor. "This is what I know. It's just the beginning." Victor took the folder, his hands steady despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had come here for answers, and now he had them. The real fight was about to begin, and he wasn't going to back down. He turned to the girl, who had been silent the whole time, watching him with that same unwavering gaze. "We're going to get to the bottom of this," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "And no one is going to stop us." Victor's heart pounded in his chest as he stared down at the folder in his hands. His mind raced, trying to process everything he had just learned. The man sitting across from him, the one who had been tracking this for months, had just dropped a bombshell. Someone powerful, had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. And now, Victor was the target. He couldn't believe it. He had always known that the business world was ruthless, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't about business, rivalry, or money. This was about something far darker, something that could destroy everything he had built. He flipped open the folder, his hands trembling slightly as he skimmed through the pages. The information inside was overwhelming: names, dates, connections, all pointing to a complex web of betrayal and deceit. But the one thing that stood out was the name that kept appearing. Marcus Hargrave. The very same man Victor had once considered an ally. Hargrave had always been a silent partner in some of Victor's ventures, someone who kept to the shadows, rarely making public appearances. But now, Victor realized, Hargrave had been playing a dangerous game. He was the one behind the poisoning plot. He was the one who had orchestrated this attack on Victor's life. The realization hit Victor like a punch to the gut. He had trusted Hargrave, trusted him with information, with projects, with everything. And now, that trust had been shattered. How had he not seen this coming? How had he let someone like Hargrave get so close? "I can't believe it," Victor muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The man across from him nodded grimly. "You're not the first target," he said, his voice low and steady. "Hargrave has been working behind the scenes for years. You're just the latest in a long line of people he's manipulated." Victor felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't just about him. Hargrave had been playing this game for years, pulling the strings, manipulating people, using them as pawns. And now, Victor was the next casualty. "What does he want?" Victor asked, his voice tight with rage. The man didn't hesitate. "Power, control. He wants to take over your empire, Victor, and he'll stop at nothing to get it." Victor slammed the folder down onto the desk, his anger flaring up. "I won't let him get away with this," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "I'm going to make sure he pays for what he's done." The man across from him nodded, his expression serious. "You'll need to move fast," he warned. "Hargrave has connections everywhere. He's already one step ahead of you. If you want to stop him, you need to act now." Victor stood up, his jaw clenched. He was done playing games. The stakes had been raised, and he wasn't going to back down. "What's the next step?" he demanded. The man leaned forward, his voice low. "I'll give you everything you need," he said, his eyes flicking to the door. "But you have to trust me. Hargrave is dangerous, and if you're going to take him down, you can't do it alone." Victor's mind was already racing, his thoughts moving at 100 miles an hour. He didn't have time to waste. "I'm not alone," he said, glancing over at the girl standing in the corner. She had been quiet the entire time, watching everything unfold with a calmness that belied her age. She had been his rock through all of this, the one person he could count on. He wasn't going to let her down now. The girl looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice steady. Victor walked over to her, a sense of determination settling in his chest. "We take down Marcus Hargrave," he said, his voice unwavering. "And we do it now." They weren't going to wait. They weren't going to give Hargrave any more time to strike. The game was on, and Victor wasn't about to lose. The man across from him gave a slow nod. "I'll gather the information you need," he said, standing up. "But you need to be prepared. Hargrave won't go down easily." Victor turned toward the door. "I'm ready," he said. And with that, they left the room. The plan was set in motion. There was no turning back now. The fight for his life, for everything he had worked for, had just begun. The tension in the room was suffocating as Victor and the girl prepared for the next move. They had gathered all the information they could, piecing together the twisted web of betrayal that had been spun around them. Marcus Hargrave, the man who had been a silent partner in many of Victor's ventures, was now revealed as the mastermind behind the plot to end his life. Victor's mind was sharp, his focus unwavering, but there was still so much to do. There was no time to waste. They had to act fast, and they had to act with precision. "We need to make sure we have every angle covered," Victor said, his voice steady, though his pulse raced. He glanced at the girl, who had been quiet but vigilant throughout the entire ordeal. Despite the chaos, despite everything they were up against, she had remained calm, and that gave him strength. "What's the next step?" she asked, her voice calm but full of resolve. Victor nodded, taking a deep breath. "We need to get to Hargrave before he gets to us. I have a plan, but it's going to be risky. Are you ready?" She looked him in the eyes, and for a moment, he saw something deeper in her gaze, a kind of unwavering determination that told him she was ready for anything. "I'm ready," she said. Victor nodded and turned to the table where a few papers and documents were scattered. "Hargrave thinks he's ahead of us," he said, flipping through the pages. "He's already put things in motion, and if we don't act now, he'll be untouchable." The girl stepped closer, looking over his shoulder at the papers. "What's our move?" she asked. "We take him down by cutting off his resources," Victor said, his voice resolute. "Hargrave is a businessman, first and foremost. He's not going to risk everything if his assets are in jeopardy. We attack his financial base, his connections, and we make sure he has no way of escaping." Victor's plan was bold. They had to move swiftly, using the information they had to make a strategic strike at Hargrave's empire. The girl's role in all of this was just as crucial as his own. She had proven herself time and time again, and now, she would play a pivotal part in taking down the man who had tried to end his life. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice firm. Victor looked at her, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "I know you will," he said. "Now, let's get to work." The plan was set into motion. Victor made the calls, reaching out to his trusted contacts, the ones who had the power to disrupt Hargrave's operations. It wasn't easy. There were too many people who were still loyal to Hargrave, too many who were willing to turn a blind eye. But Victor was determined. With each passing hour, he and the girl worked tirelessly, gathering information, making moves, and positioning themselves for the final confrontation. As they made their way through the final stages of their plan, the girl began to ask questions. "What if Hargrave gets away?" she asked one night as they were going over the last of the documents. Victor paused, looking at her with a thoughtful expression. "If Hargrave gets away, it will only be for a short time," he said. "He's made too many enemies, and the moment we make our move, he'll be on the defensive. But we have to be ready for anything. This isn't going to be easy." She nodded, her resolve unshaken. "We're ready," she said. And with that, they moved forward, putting their plan into action. The next few hours were a blur. They worked quickly, making sure every detail was in place. The girl was every bit as sharp as Victor, and together, they made an unstoppable team. They cut off Hargrave's financial ties, leaked information to his competitors, and destabilized his operations at every turn. As the pieces fell into place, Victor felt a sense of relief. Hargrave's empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But the final blow came when Victor received a message, a tip-off about Hargrave's location. "He's not far," Victor said, his voice grim. "This is it." They gathered their things and headed for the car, ready for the final confrontation. The night was thick with anticipation as they drove toward the location, the streets empty and quiet. The girl sat beside Victor, her eyes focused, her expression unreadable. Victor glanced at her, feeling a strange sense of camaraderie. She had been through so much, yet here she was, standing beside him as they prepared to face their greatest enemy. "We'll take him down together," Victor said, his voice filled with determination. She nodded without a word, and as the car pulled up to their destination, the air was thick with tension. It was time to end this. Time to put an end to the betrayal and the lies. Time to make sure Marcus Hargrave would never hurt anyone again. Victor's hands gripped the steering wheel as the car sped through the quiet streets. The tension in the air was almost palpable, thick with anticipation. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it, the final confrontation with Marcus Hargrave. The man who had plotted to end his life. The one who had manipulated and deceived everyone around him, was about to face the consequences of his actions. Beside him, the girl sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She had been his unwavering ally through everything, and now, as they approached the location, Victor couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for her. She had saved his life more than once, and without her, he wasn't sure he would have made it this far. The plan was simple, but dangerous. Confront Hargrave, expose his lies, and make sure he could never hurt anyone again. There was no room for mistakes, no time to hesitate. As they pulled up to the abandoned warehouse, Victor's heart began to race. The building was dark, its silhouette looming ominously against the night sky. It was the perfect place for a final showdown, a place where no one would hear a thing. The car came to a halt, and Victor quickly glanced over at the girl. "Stay close," he said, his voice low but firm. She nodded, her expression unreadable, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. She was ready. Victor opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence. He felt the weight of the gun in his pocket, the only thing standing between him and whatever Hargrave might throw at him. He wasn't here for revenge, but he wasn't going to let Hargrave escape. Not after everything he had done. The girl followed him closely as they approached the warehouse. Victor could feel the tension in the air, the feeling that something was about to give. He motioned for the girl to stay behind him as they neared the entrance. The door was slightly ajar, and Victor pushed it open slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, the warehouse was dark, its empty halls stretching out before them. The faint sound of breathing echoed in the distance, and Victor's instincts told him they weren't alone. "Hargrave," Victor called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The warehouse was silent for a moment, and then a voice came from the shadows. "I knew you'd come," Hargrave said, his tone cold and calculating. "You always were predictable, Victor." Victor stepped forward, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. "You're not getting away with this," he said, his voice sharp. "I've had enough of your games." Hargrave stepped out of the shadows, a smirk on his face. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered. "You're nothing, Victor. Just a pawn in a much larger game. You always were." Victor clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "The game ends tonight," he said, his voice low and full of resolve. Hargrave's smirk faltered for a moment, and Victor could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the same arrogant confidence. "You really think you can just walk in here and end this?" Hargrave said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're too late. The pieces are already in motion. You've lost, Victor." Victor took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Hargrave's. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice unwavering. Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. Victor turned just in time to see a group of men, armed and ready to fight, emerging from the shadows. "I knew you wouldn't come alone," Hargrave said with a laugh. "But it doesn't matter. You're outnumbered." Victor's mind raced as he sized up the situation. There were 5 of them, all armed. He had no backup, no reinforcements. But he wasn't going to back down now. He had come too far. "You're wrong," Victor said, his voice steady. "This is where it ends." He turned to the girl, who had stepped forward, her eyes sharp and focused. "We're not alone," she said, her voice calm but full of authority. Victor's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what she meant, but he trusted her. The girl reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device, pressing a button with a steady hand. Suddenly, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Hargrave's expression shifted from confidence to panic as the sirens grew nearer. "No," he hissed. "You can't be serious." But it was too late. The sound of police cars screeching to a halt outside filled the warehouse, and moments later, officers flooded in, guns drawn. Hargrave's men hesitated, looking at each other in confusion. "This is over, Hargrave," Victor said, stepping forward with determination. The police officers quickly apprehended the men, their movements swift and practiced. Hargrave stood there, frozen in place, as his empire crumbled around him. He had lost. He had underestimated Victor, and he had underestimated the girl who had stood by his side. Hargrave was dragged to the ground, his hands cuffed behind him, and as the officers led him out of the warehouse, Victor turned to the girl. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with pride. She looked at him, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "We did it," she corrected him, her eyes meeting his with quiet satisfaction. And in that moment, Victor knew that this was only the beginning. The fight was over, but the future was still unwritten. Together, they had taken down the man who had tried to destroy him. Together, they had won. The cold night air still hung heavy around the warehouse as the police led Marcus Hargrave out in handcuffs. The weight of victory settled into Victor's chest, but it felt strange, like something still wasn't quite right. He had taken down the man who had plotted to destroy him, but the sense of relief was fleeting. It was hard to escape the reality of everything he had just learned. The world of business, the empire he had built, had been tainted by lies and betrayal. Even now, as he stood there watching Hargrave being driven away, he knew there was still so much to be done. He couldn't undo the damage. He couldn't erase the feeling of distrust that had crept into his life. The girl stood by his side, watching the scene unfold. Her quiet strength was a constant presence, and for a moment, Victor realized how much she had become a part of his world. Without her, none of this would have been possible. He turned to her, his voice filled with gratitude. "You did more than I could ever repay," he said, his words genuine. She met his gaze, her expression calm. "I just did what needed to be done," she said simply. Her words were always so straightforward, so honest. It was hard to imagine that she had only been a child not long ago. The weight of the events she had witnessed, had lived through, was far beyond her years. "You're not a child," Victor said, his voice softening. "Not anymore. You've shown more courage than most people I know." She glanced up at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. "I don't need to be a grown-up to know what's right," she said quietly. Her words lingered in the air, and Victor realized how much he had underestimated her. This was more than a story of survival. This was a story of loyalty, of a young girl who had seen the worst of the world and still held on to what mattered. She had never given up. They walked away from the warehouse together, the soft hum of the police radios in the distance. It felt like a strange kind of closure, but Victor knew better than to believe this was the end. This was just a battle won, not the war. As they reached the car, Victor stopped, turning to look at her. "Where do you go from here?" he asked, his voice uncertain. She paused, looking at him, her gaze steady. "I'm not sure," she replied. "But I know I won't be alone." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He realized that this girl who had risked everything to help him, was no longer just a part of the story. She was part of his life now. "You'll never be alone," Victor said, his voice filled with resolve. "I won't let you be." The girl looked up at him, her face softening, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. It was a smile that spoke volumes, a silent promise between them. And for the first time in a long time, Victor felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone either. As they climbed into the car, the door closing behind them, Victor couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. The battle with Hargrave was over, but the real work was just beginning. The empire he had built, the life he had worked so hard to maintain, had been shattered by one betrayal. But with the girl by his side, he felt like he could rebuild it stronger, better, and more honest than it had ever been before. Together, they had fought to survive. Together, they would move forward. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Victor felt ready to face it. And as the car sped through the quiet streets, he knew one thing for certain. They were stronger together than they had ever been apart. The days following the capture of Marcus Hargrave felt like a strange new beginning for Victor and the girl. The weight of everything that had happened still hung in the air, but there was also a sense of relief, a moment of peace before the inevitable fallout. Victor had spent the past few days meeting with his closest allies, ensuring that Hargrave's empire, which had been built on deception and manipulation, was thoroughly dismantled. It wasn't easy. There were still people who were loyal to Hargrave, and they had to be dealt with carefully. Victor knew that trust was a fragile thing, especially in the business world. But there was no turning back now. The damage had been done. As he sat in his office, reviewing documents and making calls, he felt a familiar sense of frustration. There was so much to fix, so many loose ends to tie up, and yet, through it all, there was the girl, his ally, his protector, his partner. She had proven time and time again that she was more than capable of handling herself, but even so, Victor couldn't help but worry about her. He had been her protector once, but now, it felt like the roles were shifting. She wasn't just a child anymore. She was someone who had seen the worst the world had to offer, and she had come out stronger on the other side. The phone rang, pulling Victor out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, recognizing the number. It was his lawyer. "Victor, we need to talk," the lawyer said, his voice serious. "There's something you need to know about Hargrave's financial records. We've uncovered a few things that could change everything." Victor's stomach tightened. He had known that there were still pieces of the puzzle left to figure out, but this could be the key to unraveling the whole operation. "I'll be there in an hour," Victor said, hanging up the phone. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. This wasn't over yet. Far from it. He turned to the girl, who had been sitting in the corner, reading through some reports. "We've got more work to do," Victor said, his tone sharp but steady. She looked up at him, her eyes focused. "What's going on?" she asked, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "Hargrave's financial records. There's more we haven't uncovered. I need to go meet with my lawyer," Victor said, grabbing his jacket. The girl stood up, her expression unreadable. "Do you want me to come with you?" she asked. Victor hesitated for a moment. "No, stay here. I'll handle it," he said, his voice softening. "You've already done more than anyone could ever ask. You've earned a break." She nodded, though there was a slight frown on her face. "Be careful," she said quietly. "I will," Victor said, offering her a small, reassuring smile before walking out the door. As he made his way to the lawyer's office, his mind raced. What else had Hargrave been hiding? What other secrets had he been keeping? Victor knew that the man had been playing a much bigger game. But now, it seemed like every time they thought they had it all figured out, another layer of deception was revealed. The lawyer's office was located in a sleek, modern building in the heart of the city. Victor entered, and the lawyer ushered him into the conference room, where a stack of papers sat neatly on the table. "Victor, what we've found is, it's worse than we thought," the lawyer said, looking grim. He pulled out a series of documents and spread them out on the table. Hargrave had connections with some of the most powerful people in the world. He's been laundering money through offshore accounts, and there's evidence of illegal arms deals. This goes beyond anything we imagined. Victor's heart sank. He had known that Hargrave was dangerous, but this was a whole new level of criminal activity. He glanced at the documents, the weight of the information settling over him. "This is huge," Victor said, his voice tight. "We need to make sure this goes public. The whole world needs to know what he's done." "That's the plan," the lawyer replied. "But we need to be careful. Hargrave still has loyalists. and they won't hesitate to come after you. We need to control the narrative and make sure we have the right people backing us up." Victor nodded. The stakes had just gotten higher. This wasn't just about protecting his empire anymore. It was about exposing the truth. The truth about Hargrave's crimes, about the people he had manipulated, and about the damage he had caused. As he left the lawyer's office, Victor couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over yet. The girl had helped him bring Hargrave down, but there were still others out there, waiting for their chance to strike. As he headed back to his office, he knew that the next chapter of this story was just beginning. And this time, he wasn't going to stop until the truth was out. He had come too far to turn back now. The final moments were a blur of flashing lights and the roar of police sirens as Marcus Hargrave's empire crumbled, piece by piece. The world that Victor had built was slowly being restored to its rightful place. But the scars of betrayal were still fresh. He had spent years trusting the wrong people, believing in the false promises of loyalty. And now, here he was, standing at the edge of it all, realizing that sometimes the hardest thing to do was to let go. The girl stood beside him, her presence a reminder of the unexpected turn his life had taken. He had started this journey alone, unsure of who to trust. But in the end, it was the girl who had saved him who had saved everything. Victor looked at her, his heart swelling with a gratitude he didn't know how to express. Without her, none of this would have been possible. "We did it," he said quietly, his voice full of emotion. The girl, ever calm, simply nodded. "Yeah," she replied softly, her eyes focused on the horizon. It was a moment of silence between them. A pause where words were unnecessary. Victor realized that this was more than just a victory over a business rival. This was about redemption, about learning the hard lessons life had to offer, and about finding the people who would stand by you, no matter what. They had both fought for their lives in different ways, but in the end, they had come out stronger. The fight wasn't over. They both knew that. There would always be more challenges ahead, more enemies to face. But for the first time in a long time, Victor felt like he was ready to take them on. And this time, he wouldn't be alone. As they walked toward the car, the weight of the past seemed to lift. The city was still awake, the night alive with the hum of activity. But for Victor, everything had changed. The darkness that had once defined his life, the betrayal, the lies, the constant fear had faded away, replaced by something more powerful: trust, loyalty, and the knowledge that he could face whatever came next. "What now?" the girl asked, breaking the silence. Victor turned to her, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Now we rebuild," he said, his voice steady and filled with purpose. "We take everything we've learned and we make sure this never happens again." She smiled back, a rare and genuine smile that lit up her face. It was the kind of smile that told him everything he needed to know. She was ready. They were both ready. As the car pulled away from the scene, the lights of the city flickered in the distance, and Victor knew that this was just the beginning. The future was uncertain, but with the girl by his side, he felt like he could face anything. And for the first time in a long time, he believed that anything was possible. In this gripping tale of betrayal, survival, and redemption, a young girl and a billionaire find themselves caught in a web of deceit that threatens to destroy everything they have built. As the plot unfolds, we delve into the world of power, trust, and manipulation in the realm of black stories. With a hidden enemy pulling the strings behind the scenes, Victor must rely on an unexpected ally, a brave young girl who becomes his protector and guide through a treacherous journey. Together, they uncover a dark conspiracy that leads them to confront one of the most dangerous men in their world. As they face off against the forces determined to tear them apart, they must learn the true meaning of loyalty, courage, and sacrifice. This thrilling black story is not just about overcoming betrayal, it's about finding strength in the unlikeliest of places. Through clever twists and powerful moments, this black story shows that even in the darkest times, hope and trust can light the way. With every challenge they face, the girl and Victor realize that they are more connected than they ever imagined. From heart-pounding confrontations to moments of unexpected courage, this story will keep you on the edge of your seat, proving that the most powerful stories are often the ones that come from the heart. As they close the chapter on their fight for survival, the journey continues, and the lesson is clear. In the world of black stories, no one is truly alone. The future is uncertain, but the strength to face it lies in the bonds we form, the courage we find, and the stories we create together.